Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to Unorthodox Productions, the podcast. I'm your host, Nick Everingham, and it is a pleasure to be back recording podcast episodes for you all once again. Now, unfortunately, I am the bearer of bad news. The podcast's former co-host, Bailey Norris Green, has sadly had to resign since the last podcast episode due to his various personal commitments. So, on a personal note, I would like to wish Bailey luck in his future endeavours. However, the good news is, people, in recent conversations with Bailey, me and him have discussed him possibly dropping by to do a cameo in some of the future podcast episodes. So, stay tuned for that. So, ladies and gentlemen, in 2021, I do plan to take the podcast in a new direction. And part of that, due to Bailey's departure, is me taking on some of the responsibilities of the behind-the-scenes work of the podcast. Now, to be honest, I've never been good with technology. However, I'm going to give it my best crack to learn about what needs to go into the work that happens behind the scenes. And fingers crossed, I can pull a beer out of my sock and produce some cracking episodes for you all. And I would just like to say, Rome wasn't built in a day, and don't expect miracles overnight. So all I ask is a little bit of patience, and we'll see how it goes. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think that just about wraps up my introduction for the first episode of Unorthodox Productions, the podcast, Season 3, Episode 1, 2021. So, without further ado, let's get into this first episode. I'm excited. I hope you're excited. Let's boom, boom, shake the room. Let's boogie on into that episode. Alright, ladies and gentlemen, let's put the pedal into metal, let's put this baby in high gear, and let's kick this episode off. With a new segment on the podcast called The Question of the Day. And basically, guys, this is a new segment on the podcast where I share my thoughts and feelings about a question that is relevant to Australian society. And I would just like to mention that if you're listening to the podcast on YouTube, feel free to comment your thoughts and feelings in a respectful manner in the comments below related to the question, or anything else to do with the podcast as a whole. And if you are listening on Spotify, feel free to jump across to the Unorthodox Productions Instagram page, which will be linked in the Spotify description, and feel free to DM the account about your thoughts and feelings about the question of the day. And I would just like to give you all a pre-warning. I'm not an academic, and I'm not saying my thoughts and feelings about each question of the day are right or wrong. That's up for you guys to decide. These are just my personal thoughts and feelings on it. And now, because it is 2021, I have to say, for the record, no offence is meant by anything said in this podcast. At Unorthodox Productions, we do not condone offensive behaviour, and we have an absolutely no tolerance behaviour to racism or sexism or any offensive actions or language. Alright, now that we have that out of the way, let's get into the meat and potatoes of today's episode. So, today's episode is something that's quite close to my heart. And the question of the day, or the topic of the day, is grief. And the question of today is grief becoming a taboo subject in Australian society? Now, as someone who has had a lot of experience with dealing with grief head on, I'm kind of in a unique position to talk about it. Now, you guys might be sitting at home, cracking open a beer, having a cup of tea, listening to the podcast and thinking, shit, Nick, what is grief? Well, I've just jumped onto the Google machine, like so, and I have gone onto the Oxford Dictionary and looked up the definition of grief. And they say that grief is a very sad feeling, especially when someone dies. And that's all they give. And their other definition is that grief is something that makes you very sad. And it can also cause a lot of problems and worry, apparently. But to me, it feels like that the idea of grief and people grieving is becoming taboo in Australian society. Now, you're probably wondering, Nick, why is that? Now, of course, there's the argument that grief affects everyone in different ways. And it really depends what sort of grief you're facing, because maybe you don't want other people to get involved in your mourning process for whoever or whatever you are mourning. Whether or not it's someone close to you, a loved one that's passed away, or your favourite character in a TV show dying. But to me, it feels like grief is an idea that is being neglected, and it's almost becoming taboo because it's almost something you don't talk about. And let me give you an example. Let's say, I'll give you my own personal example. No, I won't do that. Let me just give you a general example. Let's say your cousin Jill passes away. And in some circumstances, all your friends, all your family, all their close loved ones come to the funeral. And let's say your cousin Jill's brother. And people may wrap their arms around you at the time and say, are you okay? I hope you get through this. It'll get better. And they'll be there for you at the day of the funeral. But something that I've observed is that after the funeral is over, people drop off and just fade away like leaves off a tree in autumn. They just disappear. And you're left alone. And I feel like there is this fear of a grieving person. Now, I might be completely wrong, but this is just my own personal experience, that people don't seem to want to get involved with someone who's in the grieving process. Now, everyone is different. Some people may want to be left alone during the grieving process, mourning process, I should say. And that's totally fine and understandable. Trust me, throughout my life, I've had fluctuations of grief, and sometimes the best thing is to leave to leave the person alone when they're grieving. But there are times when you are just crying out on the inside for someone to say, "Are you okay?" And no one ever does. It's like they forget that that people forget that you've lost a loved one, or you've lost something that made you tick, or lost something that was a key fundamental part of you, and they're just, and yes, that's fine, they've got their own lives, they've got to carry on with their own lives, but I think there should be more discussion about grief in Australia, because it's got, as I've said, a lot of connections to mental health, and mental health in Australia is something that's certainly not getting any better. And I feel like grieving people are sometimes just swept under the rug completely. I'm just trying to get some composure and get my words together, people. So, and it's those times of the year, Christmas, birthdays, special Christmas and birthdays predominantly, which are really sensitive times. It can be really sensitive times for a grieving person, and for a lot of people, the grieving process never stops. It changes, but it never stops. When you lose someone, it doesn't go away overnight. It never goes away. It stays with you for the rest of your life. And yes, many people say, oh, you can go get help and advice and guidance and comfort from organisations like Beyond Blue. And don't get me wrong, Beyond Blue do a phenomenal, fantastic job with helping with mental health. But I do feel like there's this taboo forming around grief and grieving people in Australia. Like, my biggest question is, why can't people check in with people more? Now this probably opens up another can of fish. But when you're grieving, it can tear you apart inside. And I know that from my own personal experience. And there can be days where you are torn apart inside and you are trying to be strong. And sometimes you do have a build-up of emotions. But the thing is, sometimes you don't want to talk to a counsellor. Or you don't want to talk to someone at Beyond Blue. You want to talk to your friends. Or your family or your neighbour. But they just seem to forget that you might be grieving. And maybe that's the person's fault who's grieving, for not telling anyone. But it never hurts to say, are you okay? And for different people, they might just say, yes, I'm okay, but really there is something going on behind the scenes. But I feel like Australia would really benefit, and grieving people would really benefit if people said, are you okay, more often? And maybe they would just open up. And especially at Christmas. Like, Christmas has just been and gone, and for me, that's one of the hardest times of the year. I don't hate Christmas. I'm not a Christmas Grinch. I try not be a Christmas Grinch, but because I have lost loved ones, and, well, Christmas is a bloody hard time of year for me. And it's... people just simply... not that they're focused upon themselves, but they just seem to forget. And this is something that I believe we need to tackle. In Australia, we need to remember that grief doesn't go away. And I feel like people don't like talking about grief. People don't like talking about death, which is understandable. But when you're grieving, as I said, it can tear you apart inside. And if a person just says those three little words, are you okay, more often, it might save a person's life. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's come to that time in the podcast where we move into a different phase, one could say, and we move into more of a reflection mode, you could say. So, in reflection from today's question of the day, my main message would be, never forget to ask someone who's experiencing grief how they are going. Because you never know what the response might be, whether it's good, bad or ugly. And at the end of the day, there is that possibility you may be truly helping that person just by asking a simple question. Are you okay? But just remember, everyone's grieving experience is different. And for some people, during the grieving experience, it's important to be left alone, and it's important to have time for yourself. But trust me, from my own personal experience, you don't always want that, and sometimes you're just calling out on the inside for your friends and family to be there for you and to ask a simple question. Anyway, that's just my personal opinions on it. Now, it's up for you guys to decide. And hopefully I've given you some things to think about and things to consider. And lastly, I'd just like to add that don't let grieving become something that you should be afraid to talk about, because it's it's not good, but it's a healthy thing to talk about. But you have to be sensitive around the issue sometimes, and that just depends on the person. And from there, I could open up another can of worms, but unfortunately, for today's episode of Unorthodox Productions, we are running out of time. So, on a brighter note, let's finish off today's first episode of Unorthodox Productions, the podcast Season 3, with a new segment I like to call Unorthodox Facts of the Day. Alright, ladies and gentlemen, let's kickstart this last segment with the first unorthodox fact of the day. Did you know, 20 years ago, Apple launched iTunes on the 9th of January 2001. And now, in 2021, with all the other online, I suppose it's some sort of form of streaming music service, with all the other music services around, iTunes is becoming fairly redundant. So yeah, it's funny how things change. For the second fact of the day, 60 years ago, in 1961, on the 20th of January, John F. Kennedy was inaugurated as the 35th President of the United States of America. And for the last fact of the day, which connects to my love of old-fashioned music, 65 years ago, in 1956, on the 27th of January, the King, Elvis Presley, released his hit song, Heartbreak Hotel. Alright, ladies and gentlemen, I think that's me signing off, Nick Everington. It has been a fantastic first episode. I hope you can take something away from it. I hope you've enjoyed it. And stay tuned for more episodes. So, yeah, I think that just about does it for this episode. Have a good week. Stay healthy. Look after your mum. Keep hydrated. And yeah, I'll see you guys next week for more Unorthodox Productions podcast episodes. Alright, see you guys. Ciao for now.